Great. So a quick introduction to Earth.org. Earth.org is a not-for-profit environmental organization based in Hong Kong. Our aim is to bring attention to what is happening to natural ecosystems worldwide. We advocate for sustainable economic policies for the protection of the natural environment and an extension of governance or oversight to cover the global commons. With Earth.org Talks, we're engaging with inspiring change makers and thought leaders to share their opinions and knowledge with our global audience, all to bring attention to what we humans are doing to our planet. So welcome, Tim. For our audience, we'd like to introduce Tim Jackson. Tim is the director of the Center for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity. Tim is professor of sustainable development at the University of Surrey. He's the author of the landmark book, Prosperity Without Growth, originally published in 2009 and updated in 2017. And he's one of the leading researchers into the moral, economic, and social dimensions of prosperity on a finite planet. So Tim, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. It's good to be here.
Thank you. We're fascinated by the insights into the effects of growth on society and the natural world and how the life needs to develop beyond capitalism. Your book, Post-Growth, is an incredibly engaging analysis of the critical issues that are already defining the future of humanity. Your unapologetic and eloquent vision of a post-growth world is what we think makes this book so appealing and so powerful. So Post-Growth, Life After Capitalism was published in paperback in March 2021. Tim, just to open, what do you think are the greatest risks that face humanity today?
I think most obviously, I suppose, the risks associated with climate change, the loss of biodiversity, and the damage that an ever-expanding economy is creating on nature, on the world that supports us. And I think to some extent there's a danger that sort of underlies and goes beyond that, which is the danger of a kind of blindness to it, a lack of care for it. And that lack of care manifests itself through social relationships as well as our natural relationships. And it leads to, it has the potential to lead to a deeply unequal world, a world of restless division, of lack of care for each other, and lack of respect, actually, for the ideas that keep us together and glue us together as a society, and the values that we hold in common. And it's difficult to say that it's a greater loss than the loss of the natural world. It isn't, but in human terms, it is, to me, an equal loss, that we are in the process of creating a society in which that ethic of care goes missing. And that's a danger, not just in terms of long-term lack of resources or even the imminent challenge of things like climate change. It's a social danger. It undermines our relationship to each other. It undermines the integrity of our politics. It undermines the ethics of our society, and it makes our world a less caring and more dangerous place to be living in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the consequences of economic growth are becoming pretty starkly obvious, whereas before they were sort of hidden. Although there was tremendous damage happening to ecosystems worldwide, it was slow. It was perhaps out of sight, but I think it's now coming home, and the extent to which we've already degraded in ecosystems is perhaps more widely acknowledged. Do you think that the human race is sleepwalking into a kind of hell on earth?
It could potentially be that way. I mean, in Post-Growth, in the book itself, in the writing of the book, I almost parked that question, because there's plenty of disaster stories. We're almost surrounded by them, and it worries me to some extent that we've created almost, particularly from academia, I would say, an industry almost of horror stories about the damage that we're creating to the planet and the shortness of the time we have to fix it, and the dark, dangerous future that we're walking into. And I suppose part of what I wanted to do with Post-Growth was to sort of say, yeah, guys, we've heard that, we know that, we know that stuff. what if we turned that on its head? What if we thought differently about this in terms of not locking ourselves into that future, not even panicking about that future, but taking a moment almost out of time to imagine a different kind of world, and to understand what the values of that world might be, what its parameters might be, and in doing that, to begin to imagine a world in which actually things became better for us, not just in terms of the impact on the planet, but actually in terms of the richness of our own lives and the values and qualities of our own lives. So I do worry, of course. I mean, everybody, or many people we know now, do worry about climate change, do worry about the future, do worry about the loss of species. And yet we also know that there's only so much worry that the human being can take, and before it slips away into forms of, denial or resistance, or even just, wanting to party because it's too much, thinking about all that dark stuff. And so I think, to me, there's a value in recognizing that threat exists, and that sleepwalking into the danger is real, and yet just putting it to one side to think a little bit about the kind of world that we could create, the kind of society that we could be, and to rethink what we mean by progress in the light of those dangers. And that's a process, I think, which is very opposite from sleepwalking.
Yeah, I think there's a very good argument to say that people, to get people to go down a path, it's as much about what inspires them in terms of the where they're going, and the goal of where they're going, and they see something over the hill or they envisage something over the hill that's a positive environment, as much as scaring them, pushing them down a pathway. And I agree with you personally, but also I think, doom mongering, or it being overly focused on the negative, possible negative outcomes that to some degree or not are becoming more likely, is perhaps unhelpful to some extent, and can as you say, can create either a negative reaction or inertia, or complacency, or people just get distracted, as you say, and go off onto other less depressing topics. So I mean, this is why the book, I think, is it's a very philosophical book. It's really refers to a tremendous amount of literature, to the past, to inspiration examples, and I think that that's what makes the book such a great read.
Thanks.
The runaway growth, I mean, on that, to sort of talk about the topics of growth, and whether runaway growth and production inevitably leads to worsening climate change, and whether in your view green growth is actually possible.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a question that I park rather than expand on in post growth, although I talked about it a lot, obviously, in prosperity without growth. And to some extent, it's a question of numbers, of playing a game with numbers. If you're growing at X%, and you're improving your efficiency at X%, then you can just about stay on a level in terms of your material impact on the planet. If you want to reach hard targets of reduction for things like carbon, then your efficiency has to move faster than your scale. Efficiency has to outrun scale over and over again, and you have to keep working at that, making them more efficient, less materially intensive. And the more you want your economy to grow, the faster you have to do that. And ultimately, you kind of you're left with basically with sort of thermodynamic limits of what you can achieve if you're trying to produce goods without using energy, materials, and having an impact on the planet. So there's and you can play those numbers games, and you can sort of say, well, if we want to meet our target for net zero, let's say in the UK, and we want to do that in such a way that we remain below the 1.5 degree warming threshold that now everybody agrees is the right kind of target to have, then we've got to reduce our carbon at around about carbon emissions at around about 20-25% per year almost, in order to achieve that net zero target and remain within the 1.5 degrees. And that means if your economy is growing faster, your carbon intensity has got to come down even faster than 25% and so on. So you can play these games with numbers, and I can almost feel our listeners' eyes glaze over as we try and dance angels on the head of a pin to decide how fast we can keep growth going and still meet our carbon targets. And ultimately, it seems to me that it's almost impossible to answer those questions. We do know that we have a lot of very good technologies which could reduce our carbon emissions, for example, massively over quite a short period of time. But having decided that those technologies exist, you then have to say, well, is it feasible that we're going to implement those under an economic system that's pushing faster and faster towards economic growth, because that's the way that it organizes itself? And then you have to understand the way it organizes itself. And you see all these incentive structures, for example, for producers to produce more and to produce faster and have stuff thrown away faster so that they can increase their revenues and make profits and keep shareholders happy. You've got all that structure on one side pushing the growth machine forwards. And then you've got a system that encourages people to consume as fast as possible, because that's what keeps those revenues flowing. That's what keeps those products being needed. And without it, the system begins to fall apart. And you look at that system, which is a system of, people, ordinary people like us, being persuaded to spend money we don't have on things we don't need, to create impressions that won't last on people we don't care about. And on the other hand, you have all of these producers trying to keep their shareholders happy. And you say, is that a system in which we can deliver that degree of decoupling that will give us green growth and meet our carbon reductions fast enough? And you have to, I think, at that point say, no, all the incentive structures are pushing in the wrong direction, towards a more consumerist world, towards a more materialistic world. And that means the use of materials and energy in ways that cannot be decoupled from the output that we're chasing in terms of economic growth. And it's that dynamic, it's that sort of combined dynamic, that almost perfect marriage between the restless consumer and the innovative entrepreneur, that creates the dynamic that makes green growth, to me, an infeasible solution. It's a way, if you like, of trying to keep the economic system that we've got without challenging it too much, in order to try and meet a goal which is looking more and more difficult to meet without that deeper challenge to the system.
Yeah, I think we'll come a little bit more later to sort of more radical possible outcomes or more radical actions that may be in fact needed. And I think you make a very good point about the moral relevance of government in this situation if they're not looking after the interests of their people. And definitely we'll come to that. And just a little bit more on growth, which is really around this, whether it's possible, as you said, and you've touched on it, whether the wealth and living standards that many people aspire to can really only be purchased at such a damaging cost.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, of course, it depends what you mean by wealth and what living standards are, but the kinds of wealth and the kinds of living standards to which we aspire in our social media engagements and in our, personal desires and in our political aspirations at the national level, those kinds of levels of wealth we know already are beyond the capabilities of the planet. And at the moment, we also know that some people achieve them and some people don't even get anywhere near them. And a planet on which 8 billion people are all aspiring to live a highly consumerist Californian lifestyle just doesn't stack up with the resources that we know we have on this finite planet.
Yeah, absolutely. So GDP, I think many economists, and there seems to be kind of an emerging movement that recognizes that GDP is not only imperfect, it's fundamentally kind of flawed as a measure. It's asking the wrong questions. It's not even the right test. But is GDP really just a country-sized pissing contest?
It's turned out that way in some ways. One of my experiences after Prosperity Without Growth was published, and I talk about it a little bit in Post Growth, was turning up at Treasury, trying to talk about these ideas with an advisor of the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And at the end, that's pretty much the only thing he had to say to me. What's it going to feel like when I turn up at the G7 and we've slipped down the ratings and we're not pissing furthest in the contest? And of course, there's an element of human nature in that, and there's an element of national pride in that. But it's particularly perverse when the measure that you're using to see how far you pissed, to extend the analogy, as it were, is the wrong measure. You're not measuring things that matter. You're just measuring something that is if you like, it's a good measure of the busyness of the economy, but it's not a very good measure of the quality of our lives. That's one side of it, that if you're going to engage in a pissing contest, you better have the measure right. But the other side, of course, is whether that is all there is to being a good nation, is having the highest output or the highest output per capita. And I think, there are very good arguments and people who've made very good arguments to say that forms of soft power and engagement and communication and relationship and diplomacy between nations that can provide for a much solid vision of national identity than something as crass as one number that measures the wrong thing.
Yeah, in your book, you quoted Robert F. Kennedy. You said that GDP measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile.
Yeah, and it's extraordinary. I mean, I started the book almost with that quote, partly because it, it was part of my personal story, sort of discovering this speech that Kennedy made back in 1968. But also because of the depth of the critique that he engaged in about the vision of progress at that time. And that was, 50 something years ago now. And we're still having to remind ourselves actually of those values and that vision, even now, over half a century later. And that's part of what I wanted to do in the book, was to sort of argue and to present this. It's not exactly a continuum, but it's like a sort of something that's been bubbling away under the surface of this crazy model of capitalism, consumer capitalism, that's running away with us and from us, and say, actually, these ideas and these thoughts and these alternatives have a rich support base in the thinking of really inspirational people over not just decades back to Robert Kennedy, but actually, centuries and sometimes millennia. So I use a Chinese sage called Lao Tzu, for example, who set out the fundamentally thinking about the ways that humans can be happy and can organize society and can show leadership 2.5 millennia ago, that are still relevant, I think, to the task that we're facing today, which is a task of fundamental renewal of what human progress means. And it, because it's such a deep task, because it is such a kind of philosophical task in some ways, I think knowing that those resources are there, of inspirational women and men who have created an example of something different and thought through the processes through which we engage in society, the processes through which we relate to each other, and have thought through them in ways which are outside the normal boundaries of capitalist society. That's a real resource for us now. It enables us to think differently and to recognize that our future is not one that's laid down by disaster or sleepwalking into disaster, or indeed by the institutions that we tend to think of as fixed, immutable aspects of life. They're not. they're a kind of construct of a different strand of human thought. And by positing these different strands of human thought in context with each other, we can begin to see how we could do things differently.
Talking about immutability, when a part of the UK government, the Office of National Statistics, is starting to talk and to compile alternatives to GDP as an experiment at this stage, and countries like New Zealand are actually announcing that they're moving away from GDP. Do you see a hope in the progress of this work by some to create new measures of progress to replace GDP?
Yes, I do. I mean, I see it's inevitable, really. Even the architects of the GDP recognized that it had its limitations, and those limitations, they're not just limitations in terms of excluding the value of the planet that we're trashing as we expand our economy. There are even some fairly basic economic aspects of the GDP that don't really stack up properly, don't tell you what the future means. And that became very clear, actually, during the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, because in the years just before the financial crisis, prime ministers, presidents were looking at the growth of the GDP, and our prime minister actually at that point said, it's the strongest period of economic growth in 200 years or something like that. And because they were looking at the GDP, they were looking in the wrong place. They were looking at a number that was just almost artificially designed to, as far as possible, to keep going up. And all of the policies were oriented towards making it go up. And what they didn't see was underlying economic fundamentals that had gone missing, that there was too much debt, that the debt was in the wrong place, that it was unbalanced, and that we had not been thinking about the future enough, even in economic terms. So immediately, even from that, you can see that how flawed the GDP is. It doesn't tell you even what's going to happen in the next year or so if you're not paying attention to all of these other indicators. It's like, if you're trying to drive a car, let's say. I mean, obviously, that's not a very nice analogy in the sense we don't want everyone just driving cars. But let's suppose that was our aim. Good life is about driving cars around, but you only ever pay attention to the rev counter, how fast the engine is going round. You're going to come to disaster soon rather than later, because it doesn't tell you what's around the corner. It doesn't allow you to steer the car. You don't know whether the indicators are on. You don't know if the lights are flashing. You have no idea even of the speed you're going if you're just looking at the rev counter. You're not understanding how to manage that future and how to actually achieve what you want from the goals in life. The GDP is massively inadequate as an indicator. And so everything that's happening, and the work as you describe it in New Zealand and other places, and indeed the work that the ONS is doing here, the Office for National Statistics has been doing for some time here. It was work that I was engaged in very early on when I was on the Sustainable Development Commission. We pushed them actually at that time to begin to do this work. And thinking differently about well-being, thinking differently about the indicators that we use to measure progress is an absolutely vital part of being able to have a different kind of society, a different kind of, if you like, a different kind of route map into the future.
I think I'm quoting Joseph Stiglitz, but he said, if we measure the wrong thing, we'll do the wrong thing.
Yeah, exactly. And that's interesting. I think that there were two different things about that Robert Kennedy speech that really struck me. One was that it did ultimately, I mean, it took a while, but it did ultimately kick off a discussion about the adequacy of the measure. Are we measuring the right thing? No, it's not a good enough measure. So there was a commission that Stiglitz co-chaired with Amartya Sen that was set up by the then French President Nicolas Sarkozy back in 2009. A huge commission. There's all this stuff by the ONS. There's the work in New Zealand and other places measuring well-being differently. So it's all about measurement. And that was one of the things that I think, one of the points that Kennedy was making in that speech. But it also struck me when I went back and listened to that speech, and you can find a lot of these things, and I've put references to them in the notes in Post Growth, because it's just, there's almost like a little separate book in the notes, because it points you to lots of resources where you can go and see these historical things or listen to them yourself. And when you listen to Kennedy's speech that day, measurement is just one of the things that comes out of it, but also what comes out of it is this sense of inquiry into the kind of society that we want, the kind of values that we want within society. And it's a sense of, rejecting the inevitability of poverty, rejecting the inevitability of the destruction of our natural world, and embracing a vision of progress that includes everybody, and that includes our relationship to nature. And it's interestingly, the measurement aspect of Kennedy's speech is the one that probably has had the most attention over the 50 years or so since he made that speech. And yet this question of the values that inhabit politics and the values that politicians themselves stand for has never been more timely, I think, than it is now. The time I was writing, of course, I was comparing Robert Kennedy, a would-be presidential candidate in 1968, to an incumbent president, President Trump, who was almost the complete antithesis of all those values. And the damage that's kind of been created by the politics of Trump, and to some extent the politics of what's happened in our country and some of what's happened in Europe as well, the damage created by that politics is profound. And it's not just a damage that is preventing us thinking seriously about the damage to the planet in the future. It's a damage that is real and very present in our lives, in the collapse of social relationships and the undermining of the fabric of society. And that's what Kennedy was also saying in that speech. It was about measurement, but it was also about values.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you can, as you said, you can find the speech online, and I've certainly seen parts of it, especially a speech he made which you also refer to, which is the speech he made on the evening of the announcement of Martin Luther King's death, which is, also a very moving and inspirational speech.
That's one of the, that's probably a more moving, more inspirational speech than the GDP speech, but it has within it that same sense of a man who put common values at the heart of political vision.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about GDP and its relation to strength, or the perception of strength, and that in a competitive world where nations still act and think competitively from a defense point of view, from a security point of view, that lock-in with growth, military strength, governmental thinking that relates to that, is based on the last few hundred years of competitive nation states, and that's continuing, and in fact in some cases getting darker, especially between, let's say, China and the US. But I suppose very long run, you could argue that we can only decouple the kind of driver if there was effectively demilitarization to a much greater degree. So if you were to think 100, 200 years ahead, can you envisage a world in which, alongside these changes to the economic structures, there's actually some much more fundamental global governance changes that perhaps are needed really for it to come into place?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there definitely are needed, those changes in governance. I think we've given away our concept, even our belief in government, at precisely the time that we need it most. And I would argue that's another point where we're running into a huge danger, because if once you've given away the idea of government, then the only thing that you've got left is either a kind of brutal war of all against all, everybody just trying to look out for themselves, or a self-constructed set of a social vision, if you like, that brings social integrity almost from the bottom up without any help from any institutions, any political institutions, any meta institutions whatsoever.
Mm.
And although, there are some philosophers who think that at least was the way that society worked before industrialization, before the notions of progress that we now have, and before the political forms of government that we now have, I think it's a little naive to suppose that if you could just take away government altogether, you'd be left with a wonderful altruistic state in which everyone helped each other. I think to some extent, my argument is in the book that the process of thinking through politics and thinking through government has not yet reached its final conclusion. The forms of participative democracy that we take as read in modern Western societies are not the end of government. They're not looking after the poorest well enough. They're too captured by industrial interests, and by being captured by industrial interests, they then become prone to this militarization process, which let's not forget is also partly driven by industrial interests. You can't have a militarized world without armaments, and armaments are produced, and they're produced by companies with commercial interests, and they're sold to people across the world, irrespective of the politics in those different parts of the world, because they generate what are seen to be useful profits and useful contributions to the GDP. So we come back to that measurement problem. We're still trying to get this growth in the GDP, so we're prepared to sell everything. We're prepared to sell, betting that undermines people's financial security, pornography that undermines relationships, armaments that undermine peace across the world, all in pursuit of this one false number, this false god of GDP growth. And so those all of that is mixed together in some sense, but the prospect actually of thinking through a sense of government that is not about militarized conflict, a sense of the relationship between states that is not simply based on competition, a sense of solidarity across nations, which does interestingly exist and perhaps exists better amongst poorer nations than it does amongst richer nations. But this kind of sense of solidarity that people, particularly poor working people in different nations across the world, have more in common with each other than they do with the richer counterparts in their own nations. This kind of cross-national solidarity that is being picked up, for example, through workers' movements and through cultural initiatives across different parts of the world. These, I think, are all part of what could be, a politics of solidarity, a politics that was less competitive, and a sense of the nation state which has a richer and more humane identity at its heart. And I think that is as much a struggle in a way, that sense of creating a vision for government and a vision for politics that has that solidarity at its heart. That is as much a challenge to us and as much a task for us as thinking through the changes in the production system that will make our target for net zero achievable. They're things, they're profound things that we have to look at within our society in order to create that positive vision for the future.
I think you raised a really interesting point, and I think someone well said that human society is quite like a teenager. It's quite immature. It hasn't really learned the rules. It hasn't really learned how to behave without causing damage. It's got muscles, but not enough sense. And in many ways, as you said, the structure of democratic institutions, of democratic government, the lack of long-term incentives for politicians to think intergenerationally, the totally inadequate frameworks in which free market or market economies operate. These are all just signs of, as you said, a lack of thought or a lack of development. Whereas, we see a lot of people really believing there's a lot of stasis when it comes to political institutions. You found your country 2 years ago, you have your civil war 500 years ago, and you think, okay, we cracked it, we did it, we've got the best form of government. And whether you're British or Swiss or American or Finnish, or Australian, you to some extent there's always a national pride about the political system that you're used to. And I guess everyone is thinking, a lot of people are thinking, will it take real crisis, or will it take civil disobedience on a much larger scale, preempting what we hope would be a total meltdown, that would actually would be the catalyst for real change? And certainly you made this point in the book.
Yeah, I mean, in the book, I do talk about civil disobedience, and I talk about its legacy in political thought. You can find it way back in the writings of John Locke, for example, who is the social philosopher on which much of modern democratic thought is based, at least at one level. And you can find similar ideas actually in that the work of that Chinese sage that I was talking about earlier, Lao Tzu, that actually it's people that give power to government, and it's people who can and should take power away from government when that process is not working properly. But I also, that's, and I think you're right to say that has to be seen as a preemptive motion. It's not about creating the discord that will lead to revolution that will overthrow everything, at least not to my mind, because most historical examples of those processes are brutal, violent, have huge cost in terms of human life, and have repercussions that go on for decades, if not centuries. So it to me, anything we can do now which supports that process of change towards a better form of government is keeping us away from those dangers. It's stopping us from falling into those nightmares actually of violence, barbarism, retribution, and so on. And for that reason alone, I think civil disobedience is a very powerful tool to have in the world and to recognize as a fundamental part of political legitimacy. But it isn't in itself sufficient, I don't think, and in the wrong hands and in the wrong circumstances, that those forms of civil disobedience, which start out as non-violent and legitimate, can very quickly tip over into more dangerous situations, which is why it seems to me that civil disobedience is like a canary in the coal mine, to use a sort of old-fashioned analogy. When you see that the canaries are suffering from the fumes in the coal mine, you know that the miners are soon going to follow. When you see civil disobedience on the street, you know that the forms of security around government are beginning to fail. And that's a point at which you have to, I think, begin a deeper political process, a deeper process of political reform, to recognize that, that we're not at the end of governmentality. We're still part way through that process. And if we want to address these challenges, and they're huge challenges that we now face, then we have to begin to rethink our political processes and to set aside that sense of pride tipping over into arrogance that we have the best political system in the world, and begin to learn both from history and from other cultures actually what forms of government are possible and which forms might be better representative of something that can lead us towards a safer future. And of course, that's a very difficult thing to do, because within the system itself are these short-term electoral cycles, which government itself is beholden to. But there are moments in time. We saw one in 2000, just after 2010, I suppose, 2011, when there was an attempt to change the representational system in the UK from a first past the post to something different. We held a referendum around that, which didn't go through. But it was one of those moments in time in which you could think, actually, it is possible to create constitutional change around our system of government. And in some ways, it's becoming an increasingly important task, particularly as we see those forms of government fail and sometimes fall and sometimes lead us in directions which are positively dangerous. And so I think, that's civil disobedience is a part of that process, but so too is public debate. So too is political pressure. So too is the pressure of the electorate and the engagement of the electorate in processes of change. And it's, to me, it's an important part of a dialogue about a better future.
I think everyone's been struck by movements like climate strike for students, Extinction Rebellion, and others, where their attempt, in a relatively good-natured way, is trying to cut through the arguments to really show strong feelings about what needs to be changed, and demonstrate that, as you said, that the sort of moral authority, of government is really in question. Whether they are, taking care of the interests of not just us, population-wise, but particularly our children or grandchildren. As you said, because in many cases they don't actually have that incentive, they don't have that oversight, they don't consider the laws or policies and the impact or the benefits that it'll bring to future generations for lots of structural reasons, discount rate, short election cycles. We are seeing a little bit of Ministry of the Future, cabinet positions, these types of political reforms really on the edges, or certainly hasn't become mainstream yet. But there is even a movement in the UK, I think, for a law to be passed. I think Wales is
yes, indeed, yeah.
Yep.
It's being led by John Bird, who set
Yep.
up the big issue on the protecting homeless people on the streets, and it's a very powerful initiative. It's got some support certainly in the Lords at the moment, and as you say, there is a Future Generations Act in Wales, which has already proved influential in getting different kinds of political decisions made in the Welsh government. So these are indications that process is not impossible to engage in.
Yeah, absolutely. Indications, I think, at this stage.
Yeah,
something which we all have to kind of get behind in terms of encouraging. You mentioned solidarity. I think it's, if we increasingly become aware that we're faced with a sort of an existential threat, really, do you think that solidarity will increase? In other words, the very fact that we need to work in a concerted way against an existential threat, does actually incentivize collaboration and incentivizes people to work together and perhaps set aside differences. We saw a little bit of that of COVID, but are you hopeful that we'll gather that sense of solidarity and common purpose around the climate change and biodiversity loss threat?
I think it's in the balance. I think there's very good evidence, and Rutger Bregman does quite a good job of drawing it together in his book Humankind, that under conditions of threat, that solidarity emerges. And as you say, we did see some of that during the early stages of the pandemic. I mean, the extraordinary the community volunteers exercise that was set up to support the NHS, I think, recruited 750,000 volunteers in the matter of less than a couple of weeks when that scheme was set up, because people's initial reaction to the pandemic was not, oh, for goodness sake, keep away from me, everyone. I want my splendid isolation. Is okay, tell me what I can do to help. And Bregman reports that kind of exercise also through in the Second World War. He talks about the military tactics of Germany and the UK during the Second World War, where if you bomb the hell out of citizens, it's not, you're not trying to just prepare the ground for your own troops to walk on. What you're trying to do is to destroy their spirit and have them turn against each other, because that's what will happen. They will become more barbaric when they're under this existential threat. And it failed spectacularly because the opposite happened. It increased solidarity. So those, there is that evidence that under existential threat, solidarity increases, different values come out, the values of the day to the accepted values of the day of sort of self-interest and the pursuit of profit do to some extent step aside momentarily, at least, and something different comes to the fore. And I think, I think that that's encouraging, but I think it also needs supporting that ability of humans to engage in solidarity with each other, to support each other rather than to compete with each other, to move towards a common goal under an existential threat, and even sometimes, to engage in pure altruistic behaviors under the face of that threat, as many of our health service did under the impact of the pandemic. That's an enormous resource, but it can also be undercut by the re-imposition of selfish competitive values, particularly if they're supported by government, which is, I think, why some of these stories about, huge profits going to people who are pals of cabinet office ministers in the delivery of the services of the pandemic, why that offends people so much, is because it undermines actually what was going on in this rise of solidarity that happened across the population as a whole. So we clearly live in a situation in which it's possible for, if you like, what economists would call free riders to take advantage of that intuition, that instinct for solidarity, for their own profit. And again, what's needed there, it seems to me, is that the values that underpin that solidarity are supported by government, supported by policy, and in fact that we do call to account any parts of government that try to undermine that sense of solidarity, because it is one of our biggest, strongest, most powerful resources in terms of protecting our future. So I'm sort of, if you like, I'm not saying it's inevitable that will happen. I don't think it is inevitable that solidarity will save us, but I do think that it has the potential to, in the right circumstances and with the right political support.
Yeah, and possibly some engineering done in terms of frameworks or structures to encourage it.
I think so. I mean, I think this is one of the things, the idea that government doesn't involve itself in personal decisions or in value-based decisions is completely wrong. It's value laden to its core, our forms of government, and they always are. And so, our job is to make those values to make sure those values reflect the values that are a part of human society and that create solidarity.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, Tim, just with an eye on the clock, I just wanted to, we have a number of questions. We're covering some great ground. And do you have a few more minutes, or are you?
Sure, yeah. No, I'm good for the moment.
You've got a hard stop. Okay, great. Thanks. Well, we'll get through the questions and then be able to wrap up. But just taking a different tack slightly, would you describe yourself as a techno-optimist?
I don't think other people would describe me as a techno-optimist, because I tend to critique positions which are blindly techno-optimist. But I am interested in technology. In fact, my career started out really looking at, the power of technology in creating solutions that would help us to reduce our impact on the planet. In my early work was looking at the economics of renewable energy sources and realizing, how much actually the development of those appropriate technologies could do to reduce the impact of energy systems on the planet. So in that sense, I have an optimism around technology. And I'm not, if you like, I quite often get accused of being a sort of Luddite, that I'm against technology because I don't think technology can produce all the solutions that we want. And people who are real, gung-ho technological optimists believe we can solve all our problems because we're absolutely clever and ingenious, and our technologies will save us. I don't believe that simplistic creed. So if that's what technological optimism means, I'm not. But actually, I do have a profound interest in what we can do with technology. And I think there's a form of kind of appropriate technology about which I am optimistic.
Yeah, I mean, is it possible that we could find ourselves in a situation where well-meaning technical solutions exacerbate or lead to unforeseen
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
consequences.
Michael Moore's film, I can't remember the name of it now, but that was basically his case in that film was,
Yeah.
lots of people saying they're solving climate change, creating all this problem around devastation of land and the impact on water systems from inappropriate installations of different kinds of technology. It's quite clear that that happens in all sorts of ways. And that's, I think, one of the reasons we have to be not skeptical about technology, but careful about its application.
Yeah. I think it's, whether something should be researched and money spent on research, if only to understand the risks. It does seem certain of some of the geoengineering solutions seem to. I think it's not as if you can't contemplate them at all. I think it's actually I think it's an argument to say it's worth spending money to research in order that it's better understood and it doesn't just get grabbed later as a desperate solution and it's been properly looked at before.
I think that's a good argument. I mean, I'd also think there's a point at which you should sort of say, is there a showstopper here?
Yeah.
Is there a danger that is actually already telling you that technology is not going to be one that is your technological savior in the way that you hoped? And if there is a showstopper, then you probably start to look in a different direction.
Yeah. Let's hope that some of the more outlandish, as putting mirrors in the sky and this kind of idea and sulfites and so on are ones which, as you said, quickly get the risks better understood and perhaps get put onto the side. I mean, I suppose, myself, I'm hopeful that technical solutions and technical innovation will accelerate the path of decarbonization. Perhaps in surprisingly rapid ways. The prices may fall to make certain technologies competitive. Which
we're definitely seeing that. I think that we're seing that already. Yeah.
It can really undermine or really kind of take the wind out of some of the infrastructure that seems to be locked in, and we've seen a bit of that, I think, which is really encouraging. I mean, in that kind of long-term thinking, do you see that? Are you hopeful that humans can wise up to some extent, find a path to sustainable post-growth future, and what does that pathway look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that gives me hope is a sort of understanding, which I guess I've developed over some time, through the work that we were doing initially in the Sustainable Development Commission, thinking about what prosperity itself actually is, what the good life consists in, and the lessons that come out of that from all sorts of places, from everything from academic sociology to ancient philosophy to just asking ordinary people on the streets, tells us that actually, prosperity is quite a complex thing. It's not about having more and more, having greater and greater wealth, that it starts with something as simple as health, and then it extends to our mental health and our relationships with our friends and family and the security of that, and then it builds from that into our sense of embeddedness and participation in society and our sense of meaning and purpose in the world. And it seems to me, that one of the biggest casualties of capitalism really is that it has neglected that richness of what prosperity actually means. And it's tried to teach us that abundance in material terms, that comfort in physical terms, expansion in almost every terms, that these are the things that prosperity consists in. And the casualties of that, apart from the impact on the planet and the impact on social solidarity, the other casualty of that is that we do not lead lives of richness in terms of a philosophical prosperity, that we forego those opportunities sometimes to experience the most profound things that human beings can experience. And quite a lot of post-growth is dedicated to that idea that a life after capitalism is a richer world in which we pay more attention to those relational aspects of our life, and also more attention to the processes that give us as human beings a sense of meaning and participation in society. and that those things are not just neglected in capitalism, they're undermined in capitalism, because we're constantly moving on from innovation to innovation, from bling to bling to bling, and missing actually the richness of engagement in task actually provides some of the most profound satisfactions that humans can experience. And I talk in the book about this experience of flow, of being in flow, of being so immersed in something that you're doing that you almost lose the distinction between yourself and the task and the world. And these peak experiences, which are, typically in common parlance thought of as things that only elite sports people can experience, or that mystics can experience, that this form of experience is actually something that creates an image of the future, a kind of what I sometimes call a new humanism, a real power in the human psyche to connect itself to other people and to the world through this application of our abilities and our consciousness in ways which we have only tapped the very tip of the iceberg so far, and that it's in danger of being taken away from us by the relentless novelty-seeking hedonism that capitalism encourages. And so the world, the world after capitalism, to me, is this richer place. It's this place with enormous human potential. It's a place where we don't even know yet exactly how much we can become richer, because we have consigned our vision to a narrow part of the human psyche, and even to quite small parts of the human brain, as neurophysiological evidence is beginning to tell us. And that this enormous expansion of human potential that is consistent with a less materialistic world, and is consistent with a safer planet and a greater solidarity in society, is available to us, and it's available to everyone. One of the things that I really strikes me as you begin to think about the nature of these experiences is that it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman, if you're black or white, if you're rich or poor, if the color of your skin, the place you were born. Actually, this human potential is something that, in principle at least, is available to everyone. It isn't restricted by the material restrictions of the physical world. It isn't something that necessarily has to lead to climate change. It's a richness, it's a prosperity that we can legitimately think of as being a goal for everyone in society. And creating the conditions for that, of course, is still a challenge, but it's one that makes sense in a physical world that's defined by limits.
Yeah, it's as though one could look at the course of human development as being one where purpose was very much around survival. Religion and the churches formed a part in giving a framework in which to operate, but in a consumerist world where, as religious influence is on the wane and life is less around survival, although it could become again in the future in certain scenarios, that there is a rising awakening that the sort of the church of consumerism doesn't really hold that much value. It doesn't really lead you down the right path. It doesn't give you the sense of purpose or the rewards, the emotional rewards that I think people expected it to, or that we were told in a way or guided to believe as we grew up in this.
I think it's, in some sense, it's worse than that, because when you look at it closely, you find that church of consumerism trades not on happiness, but on unhappiness, on dissatisfaction, because it's that dissatisfaction that keeps us coming back in the hope that next time it'll lead to happiness. And that's, I argue in the book that that's a systematic thing. That's a part of the dynamics of the way that consumerism works, and it's precisely why it's leading us in the wrong direction.
Yeah, absolutely. It plays on on a kind of human characteristic of wanting more or wanting to gorge when something's available. I suppose defined in our DNA over tens and nearly 200,000 years of human development and existence as hunter-gatherers. When we had something available to us, we would tend to keep it and eat it because we couldn't keep it. But it does seem that we're adjusting and we're struggling, or human society is struggling to adjust to very different parameters in which we can operate, and that's something which again is perhaps needs government to, as you said, lay helpful frameworks or incentives to encourage the right behavior. And we're seeing increased, I suppose, attention being given to eating habits, health habits. These initiatives, which are positive initiatives around cycleways, around sugar reduction, salt reduction, they are quite detailed in terms of their kind of interference, I suppose, in normal life. But I suppose for reasons that hopefully bring societal benefit. But I suppose we'll see more of that, not less.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I hope we see it in a sort of fairly sensible way rather than a tokenistic way. I think there's a danger that you're sort of saying you're making these tokenistic interventions at the same time as you're encouraging the profitability of your fast food chains and your junk food outlets because they contribute to GDP growth. So in some ways, I do see it as a very positive outcome, if you like. It's not an outcome exactly, but it's one of the things that happened through the pandemic was this understanding that health was a precursor to morbidity through the virus. And so actually improving population health is a really, really good thing to do, a sensible thing to do. But I think there's a next step, and that next step has to say, well, then let's prioritize that over the pursuit of profitability of the sectors which are undermining that population health.
Just a final wrapping up question, a broad one. What kind of new world do you dream of?
I dream of one in which this certainly we can legitimately pursue a common vision of prosperity, because I think what's wrong about what's deeply damaging to us at the personal level is that we're invested in a vision of prosperity that cannot be achieved by everyone. And so we end up with this kind of cognitive dissonance, if you like, that our sense of doing well in the world can only be maintained at the cost of other people who can't do well in the world, and the people in the cheap supply chains in other countries that are working in awful conditions, or the people who are suffering from the impacts that our choices have on the planet. So we're given a vision of ourselves and a vision of our prosperity, which is deeply dissatisfying at some level. And so the dream that I have of the world of the future is one in which, on the contrary, we are immersed together in the pursuit of a dream that is accessible to everyone. It's not the same prosperity for everyone, but it is available to everyone, and that it consists in an understanding of our enormous human potential, and it also consists in an understanding of the importance of our relationship to each other in achieving that potential. And it's a very, very different place. It's in the dream pink rose tinted version, it is a kinder world. It isn't just about kindness. It also has to be about strength and about discipline. It could potentially be a less comfortable world, because I think there's very strong evidence to suggest that we don't reach that potential in ourselves when we constantly have our eyes on comfort. So it's a world, for example, in which we teach our kids the value of discomfort, and how taking them outside that comfortable zone actually expands their horizons. And it's those kinds of programs already exist for kids in some, and are very valuable, particularly for disadvantaged kids, in teaching them competence in themselves and teaching them engagement with the world. And to me, this this is if you like, it's almost like a polar opposite to the idea that's espoused by the billionaire space race, where everything is about massive expansion into outer space in order to keep that growth mindset going. And to me, the seed and the essence of this vision of a different world is that there is an inner space, that inner space connects us in ways that we don't even know sometimes, and is enormously productive and is enormously valuable in terms of our way through the world. And yet we are almost blind to it and blinded to it by consumerism. And so I, I come back to this idea in a way that the human potential remains dramatically underexplored, and that is a really exciting place to be.
Very much so. And thank you very much, Tim. Your book, Post Growth, is an absolutely fantastic read. We recommend it to everyone. And also your earlier work as well is if you're more economically, technically minded, that book is also Prosperity Without Growth is an essential read. And I just want to thank you very much indeed for your time today, Will. It's been a great pleasure to speak to you, and given, I think, everyone who's going to watch this additional food for thought. Thank you so much.
Thank you for talking to me. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you.